Okay, so last week I wanted to kind of pull out in a single narrative all of the great stuff of the Middle Ages and actually kind of lay that as a foundation from which we can then also look at all the horrible stuff of the High Middle Ages, which is what I'm going to talk about today, because I think it's better to start that way. It's very easy. What we're going to see at a couple junctures is early Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, they wanted to create this narrative that until them, everything was darkness, and then they brought, the true light of true knowledge. And so they threw so much of the Church of the Middle Ages under the bus, and we've kind of inherited that narrative. And so I think it's not an accurate narrative, and that's why I want to come against it. But today, as promised, we're going to look at all the bad stuff. So we'll buckle in for some misery together. These are the things I want to cover. It's so much that I haven't even finished the slides to the latter section, so we'll see what we get through. But basically, I want to talk about what happened in the papacy during this 400-year period, from the turn of the millennium to the mid-15th century. The sanctioning of violence, note the emphasis on sanctioning there, meaning to give sort of legitimization to and actually sort of a holy impetus, or nominally a holy impetus to violence. And then also we really see the degeneration of theology. I know we're in a very Protestant milieu in the South, and one of the mistakes of Protestant history is to think that all of the church was darkness until Luther came and kind of returned it to what it was with the apostles. My hope from the class is actually there's a lot of darkness in the church, but it really arises in the 350-year window just prior to the Reformation, that we see this sort of gradual decay of leadership, Christian morals and teaching and theology, and that's what the Reformation is reacting against. Not the sum of Christian history that came before, but really that 350-year window immediately before the Reformers took their action. So we'll look at some of those degenerations as well. Okay, so I want to talk about the papacy. First, I want to talk about the Great Schism, which is the name given to the parting of the church, formerly east and west, traditionally dated to the year 1054. The backdrop is, of course, as we've seen at many junctures in this lecture series and in the early church one, since the fall of the Roman Empire and the sort of division of culture there and the different administrative structures and all the different problems, the church in the east, centered in today Turkey, Asia Minor, and the church in the west, centered in Italy, are on two different trajectories, right? And they have been for a couple centuries prior to the turn of the millennium. And one of the big arguing issues, which I think we touched on very briefly last time, 2 lectures ago, was this question of the filioque, this tiny phrasal addition in the Nicene Creed. The tinderbox, sort of that affected the Great Schism, was there were Greek-speaking churches, who were culturally Greek, but under sort of the administrative authority of the Roman Church, which by this time, thanks to a lot of the help of the empire, like St. Charlemagne and the Papal Estates and all that sort of stuff, were under Roman jurisdiction. They were sort of urged to come under sort of the Roman Latin way of doing things, or else face being closed down. In response to this, the Patriarch of Constantinople, so we're kind of going to see these two big kind of big heavyweights, ecclesiastical heavyweights, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Rome, who we, for efficiency and traditionally called the Pope, are clashing, and Michael Cerularius, he retaliates even to the threat by closing down all the Latin churches in Constantinople. Again, busting the myth of how we paint the Middle Ages. There was a lot of travel, and in the new urban centers arising in the 11th and 12th century, a lot of kind of cross-pollination in that early urban development. And so we have, different cultures in the different cities, almost like the way you'd have like a Chinatown or something, and so, I'm going to shut those churches down, and he shut down the Latin churches. So there was this sort of confusing correspondence. I've read several histories trying to make sense of it. Can't make sense of exactly who said what. But it ends up with this sort of excommunication of each other. That the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome, via envoys, they say, you're excommunicated, no, you're excommunicated, and there's this sort of clash. And then what that does is, when we look at history like that in itself, There have been many, many times in church history where one bishop had excommunicated another, as we see in sort of early church council history. But, it could usually be patched back up with a friendly conversation, and it wouldn't be this huge rift. So why is this one a huge rift? Well, it's because it's the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. A couple hundred years of cultural difference, some serious theological disagreement, and then there's this excommunication, and it sort of is the thing that then cracks, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, we're not going to work together anymore. We'll be two separate administrative structures. And so from this date on, 1054, we really do see no longer is there two churches, administratively speaking. No longer is there one, but there's two churches, the East and the West. So they remain divided to this day. So it's a later history, of course, but there are 13 autocephalous Orthodox churches, sometimes called Eastern Orthodox, of Russia, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Cyprus, all these sort of Eastern territories. They are the Orthodox Church, and then there's the Roman Catholic Church. This division began 1,000 years ago. I want to speak then about the decay of the papacy. I think it's non-coincidental that when the church splits, all of a sudden we see sort of a rapid increase of missteps, theologically and administratively. I think that sort of speaks to the fact that, the Lord Jesus, when he spoke to the apostles on the night before he died, he emphasized that unity would be one of the central main ways they would need to administer, and that would actually be something that shines forth, the message of Christianity. So without that unity, the message becomes more easily corruptible, apparently. And what we see is, after the Great Schism, things really start to go south on many levels. So I want those two thoughts to be connected in your minds. So the decay of the papacy. So one of the sort of prime reasons for decay emerged from the setup of how bishops got chosen. So what you have, in the very early days of the church, what would happen is there was this sort of meeting of the minds where church officials, like say bishops, say in Alexandria in the 3rd century, a bishop would die and they would find sort of a mature, experienced presbyter or elder, and then they would put him forward for bishop, and then they would seek the ratification of the congregation to say, are you happy with this man for bishop? Sort of like with a wedding, you say, is there any just cause why this person shouldn't be bishop? And so the people would consent, the bishops would agree, and they would make a new bishop, and they'd ordain him, and so the apostolic succession continued. What that degenerated to, sort of in the wake of sort of Charlemagne's bringing together of church and state, and just the sort of the fact that all the things that kind of connected to that clerics were the administrators and were the educated ones, is princes, rather than sort of just have the congregation sort of affirming an election to bishop, what would happen is princes would just themselves often be themselves some sort of ecclesiastical hierarch, and then they would just appoint a bishop. But sometimes if the prince was just a layperson, they weren't ordained, they were like, well, that's the lay ratification. I'm a layperson, as he's this powerful emperor or prince, and he would install a bishop, and he would have control, because the prince would have say over the lands and who's using what and who's getting what portions of what taxes and harvests. To be a bishop was a powerful thing. It came with these sort of material pieces which the prince could control. So he wanted to make sure he had a man who would be kind of working with him. And so you can see how that would work out potentially benignly, but throw in the crooked human heart and the desire for greed, and what you get is princes using the power to appoint a bishop who would then get ordained by the Pope or something, using that for political maneuvering. So if you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back setups. And then even sort of actually selling them to say, well, look, hey, you give me $10,000 worth of land, and sure, your son can be bishop, right? And this is called the sin of simony, right? There's a famous instance in the book of Acts where this magician named Simon tries to give money to St. Peter to say, can you give me the spiritual power that you have? And St. Peter rebukes him. And ever since, that's been called simony, offering money for spiritual authority. So this is really corrupting to the church, as you could imagine. It really contributed to the low moral standard, because not only is there sort of low morality in the very act of appointment, but the people who are getting appointed are not eminent for holiness or learning. They're just some cousin of some royal who wants to have some land. And so you get these very morally degenerate folks getting into the upper echelons of hierarchy in the church. One of the most sort of infamous examples is Pope John XII, who, this is a description from a contemporary. I actually had to cut it off because it was longer and got more disgusting. But, you know, he's got concubines, he's ordaining people in a horse stable, he's getting drunk at, at his bishop's palace. I mean, it's like, and what does that do for both the lower clergy and the faithful people to see sort of the supposed, great authority, the Pope in Rome, living like this, right? When the head is living degenerately, it demoralizes the whole outfit. So the decay at the top was a symptom of and support for general failures of the clergy at every level, right? If the Pope's doing that, well, then why should I, Joe Christian, just going along my day, try and live to any higher moral standard? So we sort of see this downward decay of the moral standards of the church generally. So this is, just to connect with the last lecture, this is part of what prompted the reform movement of Cluny. Remember we looked at that monastery of Cluny? It was the monastic institutions had become lax because of this, because they were under the auspice of some prince bishop who was, appointed badly. And so Cluny was wanting to say, okay, we need to have sort of a ground-up, grassroots, moral reform of Christian life. And they were so successful at it, right, they got to kind of place leaders who'd been modeled on a sort of more rigorous Christian life back into the hierarchy to kind of stem the tide of corruption. So there's this sort of grassroots movement from the ground up, from kind of Cluny and some, really they're the first reform movement. There's also from the top down a few bright spots, relatively bright spots, seeking to reform from the top down some of this corruption. So you get popes like John XII, but then you get popes like Pope Gregory VII, who, very stern portrait of him here, wearing his papal tiara. He's really enthusiastic about Cluny. He's up here and he's seeing what these just sort of lay monks are doing. And he's like, yeah, that's what we need to get back to. So he tries to appoint bishops who are influenced by the Cluniac reforms. He fights hard against simony. He really drops the hammer on princes and bishops who are trying to buy and sell church offices. And he's the one who enforces clerical celibacy across the board for the first time. So up until this point, many priests were unmarried men, and so would have been required to be celibate by virtue of their not being married. And of course, there were some egregious moral failures of that, and some who kept it. It was traditionally the case ever since the 4th century that you could get married before you were ordained, but once you've been ordained, you should stay that way and single and not get married. So you kind of had this mixture of married clergy. I think I've seen that. So the majority of clergy were unmarried, but some were married. But it's Pope Gregory who says, no, the sexual license and the immorality in the church, it's so unchristian, it's so defaming of the message of purity and truth that we're trying to proclaim, celibacy across the board. And I think it's sort of like one of these things where when you see sort of decay and the strong counter-reaction, you can simultaneously see why they reacted so strongly and already sort of the problems built into it, right? I mean, I think about like, some of the things that they thought, my mind's kind of not reaching for any good examples. But I feel like this is something, like here you go, prohibition's a good thing. If you saw a gin slum in a big urban center, you would say, we need to just ban alcohol, no alcohol. And then you get all the crimes of the mob, in the face of prohibition, right? So the stern crackdown leads its own problems, but you can understand why they wanted to react strongly. Gregory's method for purifying the church was to assert a more total authority by virtue of his office. So we have actually documents called the Dictates of Gregory, and there's kind of these bullet point things of things he enacted as civil and canon law from his own fiat. And these are direct quotes from Gregory VII. Only the Roman pontiff is rightly called universal. What he means there is that his authority is the one that is Catholic over all other bishops and jurisdictions. The Pope is the only man to whom all princes bend the knee. What I want to point out is, remember, it was Leo III who crowned Charlemagne as emperor. And Leo needed Charlemagne's help. But who has more power, the one who wears the crown or the one who gets to give the crown? Right? The legitimizing force is the Pope. So that got imbued pretty quick in the papacy. And so you go, all princes bend the knee, actually making, where at first you have sort of emperor supporting emperor supporting church, the scale is tipped now 200 years later on, and it's the church is over the empire, is what's being claimed and asserted. In fact, he says the Pope is allowed to depose emperors. His sentence cannot be repealed by anyone. No court of appeal. The Roman Church has never erred, and it never will err. He's not saying this about himself personally, but about the Church. But you can see this claim will get inflated to Vatican I in the 1870s, that the Pope would never make a mistake. The Pope can absolve subjects from oaths of fidelity made to unjust rulers. That comes to play in the Reformation. So all of this assertion of power, he meant it for good. It's sort of like the ring in The Lord of the Rings. Like, he intended to try and purge out immorality. Gregory had a really good moral vision. But by amassing all this power, it's a classic case of power then corrupting. And these same powers, which he meant to use to purify the church, once amassed, would then be a cause for a later corruption of the church. Gregory beefs up an administration. He codifies what we now call cardinals, sort of the bishops around Rome who have sort of senior authority. And he says popes are going to be elected by cardinals only. No prince interference. So there's no even chance of simony. And he creates this position of papal legate, who are people directly corresponding to him, who can overrule the decisions of other bishops underneath. Again, he means to purify the church, but he pulls a lot of power into his structure. And he's a strong leader, and he does so. So what I want you to see is sort of this trajectory that we've been mapping. In our first series of lectures of the early church, we saw Pope Leo playing a really helpful, sort of definitive role in discerning theology in the 5th century. We see Pope Gregory the Great filling a civil vacuum, right? When the northern European Gothic tribes and the Lombards take over the benefits of Roman wealth, they don't fill in the administrative structure. So the city of Rome is doing badly. So Gregory becomes like this de facto mayor. And there's this kind of, a power that comes with that. Pope Leo III legitimizes Charlemagne, right? You see this progression. Pope Gregory VII declares Rome a higher authority than secular rulers. This will go further a century later with Pope Innocent III, who actually says that God gave the Pope two swords, a spiritual authority and a civil authority, that it's all part of the plan. So sort of justifying post hoc what's been amassed as a matter of circumstance. And then, in 1302, Pope Boniface VII, in a decree called Unum Sanctum, says, every human being must be subject to the Roman pontiff, right? So it begins as just sort of one of many bishops in the world, in the early church, through this sort of sequence of history, becomes the Pope as we think of him today, right? The sort of standard conception of what a Pope is wasn't there in the first couple of centuries of the church. It emerged little by little, often for good reasons. Pope Gregory the Great was a great guy. He fed tons of poor people. He made the sewer systems work again, right? He's just helping people. There's power. Gregory the Great really meant well, but he pulled all this power together and created the modern papacy. When we talk of the papacy today, it really has its sort of final shaping under Boniface VII. So do you see that trajectory? How it's sort of such a strange mix of accident and well-meaning, and yet coming to like an end that's kind of difficult to reconcile with the Christianity of the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd century, right? That every human being must be subject to the Roman pontiff. Do you see the trajectory? Okay. Part of the claims within this trajectory were asserted by a very infamous document called the False Decretals. At first they were just called the Decretals. But scholars since the 17th century recognized that they were forgeries. They were actually inventions of a 9th century forger making up, fabricating these texts that say, oh yeah, emperors are under popes and popes can overrule other bishops. This forged document to try and legitimize some of the assertions made by the 10th and 11th century popes. The increase in papal power is both provoked by and provoking of tensions between the pope and the emperor. Remember, we got this. So Charlemagne, his immediate successors were not so great, but then this guy named Otto the Great in the 10th century really revives the Frankish Empire, the Holy Roman Empire with the Frankish and Germanic peoples, and So you have this Holy Roman Emperor of the West, right, who has this authority, and he's an emperor. And now the Pope is claiming that he's more powerful than the emperor. You know, you've got, again, a clash of titans. So the Pope is, in the same era, clashing horns with the Patriarch of Constantinople, to his left, and clashing horns with the civil emperor above him, geographically, you know, clashing with both swords, theological and civil. So I want to look at two big power showdowns. There's a number of smaller skirmishes, but there's two famous ones worth knowing about that are emblematic of this bigger struggle. Henry IV versus Gregory VII, that same Gregory, the Reformer. Henry IV is the Holy Roman Emperor. He's king of the Germans, and at age 25, so he's a young emperor, he is really unhappy with Gregory's interfering with simony, right? This is a nice political tool in his arsenal. It brings a lot of money in. He's like, don't try and purify the system. Like, I like wheeling and dealing with these, you know, with my bishops, right? So Gregory deposes, and so the emperor moves first. He declares Gregory deposed because he's used as emperor to say, that bishop can stay, that bishop can go. And he's like, heck, I'll say it about the Pope. He's not even Pope anymore. And so Gregory VII says, oh, okay. And he excommunicates Henry right back. And he deposes Henry, and he says, no, I have authority. I'm the one who crowned him. I can take that crown away. And he colludes very savvily with some Saxon rivals who didn't like him as king anyways. And he goes to meet at Augsburg to crown a new king of the Holy Roman Empire. En route, Gregory stops at this little castle in Canossa, Italy. And who meets him there? But Henry IV in a hair shirt, in penitence and tears, saying, I've made a mistake, I'm sorry. And the Pope leaves this emperor outside, standing on the doorstep, legendarily in the snow, for 3 days, and only finally acquiesces to let him in, to hear his full apology, and to forgive him and let him be king. Kind of a famous incident, and so if we're keeping score, the Pope won that one in terms of the claims of who has the real authority. It ended up not being politically successful in the end. Henry was not able to keep his power for different reasons, and then he went on to try and oppose Gregory again and was slightly more successful, and it was kind of this sad skirmish. But there was this very powerful moment that really captures, I think, some of that esprit of the Middle Ages. This is a 19th century drawing, but this is a 14th century drawing of the same. So that's showdown number one. Here's showdown number two. Fast forward 200 years. Philip the Fair of France versus Boniface VII. We have a similar sort of situation, except the prompt was different. The church had amassed so much wealth that Philip the Fair was like, man, those guys are paying their taxes to the Pope. We need some of that money. Like, he's sitting in our land. Like, we should have some of that revenue. So he starts taxing clergy, but that was illegal and new for him to do. The Pope, Boniface VII, says, stop it. He says, and they kind of threaten each other, and the rulers and the bishops in France say, well, the Pope has a lot of words, but Philip the Fair has a lot of swords. And so they follow the emperor, and they say, no, we'll pay taxes to you, okay, you know. So there's this kind of back and forth, and so Philip assembles all the nobles and clergy and gathers to try and get their allegiance to try and oust Boniface VII. Boniface issues this Unum Sanctum, that document that says, no, the Pope, everyone, including every emperor, is under me. Philip assembles this legal team to try and make a case for why he was illegitimately elected. So Boniface flees to his hometown in Anagni in Italy, Anagni, I don't know, and he's harassed by this cohort sent by Philip. He dies in 1303. So now sort of civil, secular authority is rising up against papal authority and seemingly winning. And 2 years later, Clement V is elected pope, but he chooses to stay at home right next to across the river from the palace of Philip, to stay close and in cahoots. In fact, Philip definitely had a hand in his election, thus creating the Avignon papacy. The Pope didn't live in Rome for 70 years, he lived in Avignon. And then by choosing to collude with the secular power, again, it sort of led to a decay and a degeneracy and kind of a wealth-seeking on behalf of the papacy. You get kind of popes who are very limp characters. And then in Rome, they really started to resent this. 3 generations in, we need to get the Pope back in Rome, so they elect this guy in Rome, but then he's not a good leader, so they try and oust him, but he doesn't work, so they go back up to Avignon, and they say, fine, we'll have a Pope in Avignon. And so the same cardinals who elected Gregory XI, no, not Gregory XI, Urban VI, go up to Avignon, and they also then establish Clement VII, and now you've got 2 popes elected by the same college of cardinals, which creates the Avignon schism of the 14th century. The question is, will the real pope stand up? For 40 years, there's all these rival claims as to be who's the true pope. There's a skirmish, and another 3rd claimant arises out of Pisa, and then every nation had to sort of pick, well, we recognize that guy as pope, and, oh no, we recognize that guy as pope. It is a big mess. And again, add this onto the stack of things in terms of why leaders and regular Christians would be disenchanted about the church. Not only was there sort of all this moral degeneracy in living memory, now there's all these claims about, and this is on the heels of all these really high claims, everyone needs to be under the Roman pontiff. And it's like, oh yeah, right, you guys really have it together, right? All of these are sowing seeds into the soil from which the Reformation would spring, right? We're within a stone's throw, 100 years of Martin Luther, right? This is disaffecting the understanding of the church. There's repercussions, as well as what I just said. Even to this day, Roman Catholic scholars don't know which line was valid. They just kind of guess. So again, this claim of the only line of all, the Roman Catholic Church's claim today is that all bishops have their spiritual authority because they're connected to the Bishop of Rome, who has his direct descent from Peter. But actually, that line of descent is ambiguous for the Avignon schism. The more traditional claim is that all of the bishops of the church, in concert and in college together, collectively pass down apostolic authority. But you can kill one and it still exists, right? It's not this single thread through history, which is the Roman Catholic claim. So that's sort of the rise and degeneracy and foibles of the papacy, kind of for a 400-year period, which is a big window. Any questions or thoughts or things that I surely omitted? One of the things I'm realizing when I signed up for this class is there's way more information than I had in view when I was thinking about the 6 lectures. But any thoughts or reflections on these developments of the papacy?
The schism and the 3 different people.
Yeah.
You said the violence. Was there any attempts ever on any of their lives?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, popes were...
Somebody would have, hey, we'll just knock one off.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, even before the schism, when in the era when the ecclesial offices were bought and sold, there was all layers of political intrigue, of people poisoning this guy. And I think the average reign of a pope in this 400 years is like a 3-year window. I mean, because they're just getting bumped off, and very few of them die natural deaths. It's really rough. And then, how to pin down who the culprit was when the culprit had all the power to hide the authority, all that stuff. So, yeah, and there were certainly sort of these various kind of military gestures. There probably are, but I don't know of any specific sort of assassinations. But it wouldn't surprise me if there are, and I just haven't read about them in preparation for this. So, yeah. Yeah, right, yeah. Or they may have, and then another one came up, and it's all, it's wild time. Okay, well, I want to look at the second thing then. We'll get halfway through this before we take a break. The second sort of wickedness in this era of the church is the sanctioning of violence. So, first and foremost, this presents the specter of the Crusades. But I think a little bit of preliminary ground clearing needs to be done just to say what are we speaking of when we speak of the Crusades. So in very broad strokes, we're speaking of several movements in this 200-year period that had the intention of reclaiming or defending lands, perceiving Muslims to be the opponent, variously in Asia Minor and the Levant, meaning kind of Jerusalem and Syria and North Egypt. 2 of these crusades led to very bloody battles, what we think of the Crusades. One of them led to the Western Church having a toe of authority in the Levant. That was the First Prince's Crusade, as we'll see. So when we think of the Crusades, sometimes you'll hear about the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, 8th, 9th, even the 9th Crusade is sometimes catalogued. You hear about the Children's Crusade. And these are all movements that happened. But when we think of sort of a military excursion that was bloody, really we're talking about the First Crusade and the Third Crusade. These are, when you think sort of in the Crusades as it sits in a children's history book, it's really these two are the big military ones. And the first one is broken down traditionally into the People's Crusade that went nowhere, as we're going to see, and then the Prince's Crusade, which was the violent slaughter of most of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. When we speak of the Crusades, the question is always, were they religiously motivated or politically and economically motivated? And historians at the time would say, it's religiously motivated, we're just all pure zeal. And then critical historians of the last 2 or 3 centuries would say, no, they were overtaxed financially, they needed some new lands, they had this sort of, all this military zeal because of the rise of the ideal of knighthood that needed venting. Sociologists can find other reasons which are there. The facts bear it out. But the answer, of course, is both. You say, well, how can it be both? And I would just pose the same question. Was the war between the states prompted by the North's moral concern over slavery, or its desire to see the southern states politically weakened and their wealth distributed? It's kind of both, right? So we see that these things don't have to exist as binaries. Something that Muslim empires... here's what's really interesting about the Crusades. When we look at how the Crusades were spoken of in the centuries since, Muslim historians pay very little attention to them until the 1890s. It's kind of this blip. It's almost like the way, maybe a comparison would be like the French Indian Wars in American history. No one sort of is grieving, like people of, no, let's scratch that. People of European descent today don't grieve loss of life from the French Indian Wars, right? It's like, well, that was like a battle that happened and we lost some and we killed some, and there's kind of this, it doesn't weigh heavily on the conscious minds. We've got to remember, the different caliphates were enormously successful empires. They had tons of military battles of which they were victorious over tons. Huge sort of gains in economy. So the Crusades were like this kind of nasty blip on one edge of the caliphate for most of Muslim conscious history afterwards. The Crusades become really denounced inside of Western Europe by the rise of sort of secularists in the Enlightenment, guys like Voltaire, who are trying to say, look how backwards the church is, look at the Crusades. So there's this sort of creation of a guilty conscience, not guilty, a critical conscience inside of Europe about the Crusades, independent of what the Muslim caliphates understood them to be. The Crusades don't re-enter Muslim national imagination until the 20th century discussion in the face of all the decolonization and the encounters and the expanding authority of the United States, really, and England. And really then, now in the West, it's very standard to hear this sort of very sort of sheepish language about the Crusades. But prior to the turn of this last century, that didn't exist. Europeans just saw it as sort of like one more kind of military point of pride, maybe, and the Muslims saw it as just this kind of annoying nuisance of these dirty European rabble on their, on this one frontier. But that narrative really changes in the 20th century. And really, there's just two myths to be avoided. As long as we steer between them, I think we're in good, honest historical territory. The first is that Muslim Turks were innocent and were attacked unfairly. Right? I think that's a myth. The other one is that Muslim Turks were all evil beings who deserved what came to them. Right? This would be the narrative the Crusaders had in mind. This would be some of the narrative of some historians today, kind of trying to tell a Western story. And neither of these things are fully true. As so often, the real historical ground is kind of moderately in the middle. There's a book which is a really great, I think, kind of reanalysis of the Crusades. This came out in 2010 by the kind of controversial sociologist, but very good sociologist, Rodney Stark, called God's Battalions. The case of the Crusades, he's not defending them by saying, oh no, it was really good. He's just wanting to reevaluate like why they might be, why they were considered good at the time and what the sort of grounds are. And it was a good book. I've only read some of it, but it was good. So it is the case that in different regions and centuries, Muslim overlords were very tolerant of Christians and Jews, right? Like we talked about last time in Spain for that first couple hundred years, 100 years in Iberia. And you know, when we look at these sort of emerging caliphates with different ethnic groups kind of taking over the authority, we see the Seljuk Turks coming to authority in the 11th century in the Abbasid Caliphate. It's the case that sometimes they levy hard against non-Muslims, called dhimmi. Sometimes they're more lenient. It's kind of a, you know, it ranges, like with Christian treatment of other religions. It's also the case that there is within Islam a thread which supports military violence. Muhammad's farewell discourse, as it's been codified, says, "I was ordered to fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah." And he doesn't mean fight in the sense of, you know, in debate. He means fight. And this corroborates with some of the surah in the Quran, which this is Surah 9:5, "Slay the idolaters wherever you find them and take them captive." Now, Christianity was not considered one of the idolaters, but here's a principle of violence for religious purity, which in some later quadrants was taken for justification for Muslim violent antagonism against Christians. So, all that brings us to the First Crusade. But before we talk about that, let's take an 8-minute break, and we'll regather in 8 minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to come up and chat with me, but we'll pick up with the First Crusade after a brief bathroom break. Sounds good. I should add as an aside that all the papal names are regnal names. Like, that wasn't the name they were born with. It doesn't just happen that they all had the same name. They had all kinds of different names according from their culture of origin, like Northern Italy, you know, or Frankish, and but same way, like royalty would assume like a throne name, the popes took on this sort of, you know, name of office, which is why they all have the same kind of numbered names. We'll just give it one more minute. Okay, we'll start. So the First Crusade, like I said before, the Seljuk Turk ethnic group has really risen to prominence in the midst of the Muslim Caliphate, the large empire. And they're claiming land on what is today, you know, modern-day Turkey, the east side of that. And they're claiming this land. And so the emperor in Constantinople appeals to the Pope in Rome for some support, which is sort of surprising, remembering that the churches have been mutually excommunicated for just a few years, 20 years. And that he would appeal to the Pope, right? Because the Pope is sort of claiming to be and functioning as the supreme civil authority to whom Emperor Henry, had humiliated himself. And so he appeals to the Pope for military support, but the Pope does nothing. 20 years later, a different set of leaders are in those positions, and again, the emperor appeals to the Pope, but this time not just for military support, but actually making a spiritual appeal to say, look, Christians are being attacked. And then Pope Urban II, who appears to be very shrewd, everything seems to play out very like he knew exactly how it would go down and was ready for it, seizing sort of this simultaneous vision of defending Christians and being able to sort of expand Western political power and authority, because if you win a fight for someone, you get to make some negotiations about who gets that land and all that sort of stuff. He agrees to help, and he preaches at the city of Clermont in 1095. He gathers this huge crowd of ecclesiastical hierarchs and cardinals and just regular folk and city folk, and he preaches this loud message about how all of the things that the Muslims are inflicting on Christians in Byzantium and in Jerusalem, and he sort of lists assault and rape and murder, and he says all these things are happening, and it's doubtless full of hyperbole, right? And it's also probably grounded in some real facts, right? Because as we have been seeing in this era, secular, civil authority and military conquest and religious motivation are all intertwined. So you know, the Seljuk Turks are just claiming land the way people have always sort of skirmished over land. And in the way, you know, soldiers are doing horrible things, but they are under the flag of Islam. And so Urban is able to sort of characterize it as this sort of Islamic aggression against the Christian world. And he was apparently a convincing speaker. He sparks this flame of zeal that launches into this mob who starts crying traditionally, God wills it, like let's conquer. And Urban, he offers incentive. He says, if you go fight to defend Christians and these holy lands, God will be so merciful for your sins. It's called an indulgence. He said, you know, any sort of temporal penalties that you'd have been expected, you know, all these things, they'll just be forgiven outright if you go on, you know, crusade to defend Christians and pilgrims. And this massive lay folk is stirred up, and this one preacher who's this hermit named Peter of Amiens in France, he's like unsanctioned, like the Pope's Urban II's biggest fanboy, and he's like, oh yeah, and he kind of keeps whipping the crowd up, and this mob of like 50,000 people marches out of France and through Germany, and at each town they stop and ask, is this Jerusalem? You know, it's like this really pitiful picture. They arrive depleted, exhausted, and sick in Constantinople, on the west coast of the Bosphorus, in the summer of 1096, and the emperor is like, oh buddy, like, this is not going to help my war against the Seljuk Turks, but he kind of puts them on a boat, sends them across the sea to the western coast of Asia Minor, and the Saracens, as they were called, which just was the word for Easterners, they just mow them down, right? These aren't soldiers, they're exhausted, they're just sort of whipped up into this fury by these preachers, and they're just all eliminated instantly by a very capable army. The military prowess of the Abbasid Caliphate, of the Seljuk Turks, far outstripped European military skill at this time. I mean, they just had a number of technological advances, fighting skills, which then got copied from the continent. Like, oh, we need to fight like that. You know, we need to incorporate these strategies. The whipped up furor against non-Christian opponents, as they were called, infidels, spilled over. And one of the additional tragedies of this crusading era is the rise of anti-Semitism. So if we look at sort of the background of the treatment of Jews in the Middle Ages prior to the First Crusade, it wasn't favorable, it wasn't hospitable. There was sort of social marginalization, certainly, which led to a lower standard of life for Jewish people in Northern and Western Europe. And they were forced to take up unwanted professions, much as the way we see this as functioning, you know, in sort of the today's world of undocumented immigrants being sort of socially funneled into work that is undesirable by the other members of the populace. So they got into money lending because that was undesired, which then placed Jews often into personal difficulties. If you remember your days as a college student with a landlord, it's difficult when you owe someone money. You don't like that guy. And then if they're all of the same ethnicity, you know, you can see how this builds this sort of social contempt. So there was definitely this sort of like, yeah, they are God's chosen people, but you know, there was this real antipathy between Jews and Christians in the Christendom of Charlemagne and after. But this dangerous, overzealous anger, sort of against the infidel, whipped up by Urban II's first call for the crusade, leads to just sort of generalized, as we see with kind of the mind of the mob, like, that's different than us, it's with the bad guys, right? And just lumping it all together as different and therefore an opponent. And so we see the first pogroms and the Rhineland massacres. This is in central Germany. Thousands of Jews slaughtered in this sort of furor against the Easterner, against anyone that was sort of opposed Christianity. It's important to point out that these were carried out by mob masses. They were actually really condemned by the hierarchs, by those who were educated and were reading the scriptures, and you know, were the monks and the bishops. They actually like, no, stop this. In fact, the Rhineland massacre was actually following the fact that the Jews of these cities in Germany actually sought refuge in the castle compound of the archbishop, and he defended them. He like sort of made a sort of parcel of his land where they could stay, and he was defending them. And the mob axed down the doors of their own archbishop to kill these Jewish people. Historians of Judaic history will see this as sort of kind of the first chess move of what would end up playing out to the Holocaust in 20th century Germany. So it's not the case that the whole church was just all in an instant into this sort of violent anti-Semite move. It was definitely opposed. And then after the Rhineland massacres, strongly condemned by the popes. In fact, in the preaching of the Second Crusade, Bernard, who was sort of the great preacher of the Second Crusade, Bernard of Clairvaux, who we looked at, he strongly condemned the massacres of the Jews. He says, no, that's not it. We're out to fight those who sort of are hurting Christians and the Muslims. We're out to fight the Muslims in the Holy Land. And he tried to redirect and channel the furor of the mob. So that's sort of, yeah, and this continues actually in a very sad trajectory. We see after this, in the face of every other kind of military mob furor, it's spilling over into anti-Jewish sentiment, pogroms, exiling from towns. I forgot to, I can't believe I realized as I was driving here, I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't mention the Black Death in this lecture series. The Black Death happens in the 14th century, and one of the people that were scapegoated were the Jews initially to say, they're poisoning us. Right? Again, sort of out of this overflow of anti-Semitic furor. These are really shameful things to happen in the history of. I mean, this is the same church that produced St. Augustine 1,000 years before, and the disciples, and the same church that Jesus founded is now doing this. And it's partly because that church has so interwoven itself in the fabric of civil secular life that they can be so blurred together. And so that even though the church condemned it, it was still people who claimed Christ who were doing these things. And this is still the debate today, where does the true religion lie? Like, if someone claims a religion and does something wicked, is that religion wicked, right? That's the question of, is it with Islamic terrorism today, right? Are those the true representatives, or are the teachers and leaders who oppose those things the true representatives? And so a critical secular historian would say, yeah, this is just Christianity and we need to just scrap the whole thing. A more generous historian would say, no, this is actually sort of an unfortunate coalescence and fallout, but this is not Christianity. This is people who are claiming Christianity, but it's not Christianity. It's not quite the same. With anti-Semitism is a much more ambiguous case there. The Crusades themselves were claimed by the hierarchs of the church. And following the People's failed crusade, the princes marshaled their forces. This is sort of a classic 19th century vision of the Crusades as these sort of conquering heroes, like liberating the White City, like this sort of, vision of killing Muslims. The fact is that it was just this horrible bloodbath all the way down. I mean, just slaughtering, and they'd set synagogues on fire, right? So, and this was the crusade that if you went on, you get indulgences, and the Pope said it's good to do. So it was sanctioned by the authorities. Maybe not in all its details, like soldiers were always doing kind of wicked things beyond the charge. No one would say that like Abu Ghraib was exemplary of the American military, right? I mean, the soldiers are doing these bad things, but it's still given, the general direction was given by the top level, and same thing with the church here. It's a very shameful chapter. You get this picture of like knights praying in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with blood on their hands, right? After they're just slaughtering most of the Muslim inhabitants of Jerusalem. They really thought that they were doing a holy thing, that they thought they were killing people who had been raping and murdering their spiritual brothers and sisters. Like, they thought they were doing an act of defense. And this is what Rodney Stark points out, like, how do we reconcile these juxtapositions of gospel teachings with what the Crusaders are doing? They thought they were doing a defensive gesture. Whether in real history it was really that defensive is very debatable. And certainly it was not nearly as pure as they thought it was. But it is important to see, at least at some level of empathy, to see, not empathy, but understanding what they thought they were doing was killing criminals who hadn't been sentenced. That's what how they justified their violence. So this crusade was a success, right? Reconquered the Holy Lands. Of course, it's not a success morally or spiritually in any regard. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem came into existence on Christmas Day. Together with these three large eastern cities, this sort of region called Outremer exists for about 200 years. And it's kind of jostled back and forth with different kind of skirmishes of different cities and takeovers. But then ultimately, it ends up being fully taken back by the Muslim Empire. There's a number of strange consequences that result from the Crusades. The first thing is for the Latins to realize a couple of different things, that sort of who the enemies and friends were was all mixed up. As they interacted with Greek-speaking Christians, the sort of last vestiges of those who had lived under the civil rule of the caliphates, they didn't recognize the Christianity, right? Do you remember that video of the liturgy we watched 2 lectures ago with all the chanting? You know, it would have felt as foreign as that looks to a Protestant in America, this sense of like, man, like, I see a cross, but other than that, I don't recognize what's going on here, right? The sense of otherness that wasn't, you know, here we are, we thought we were defending our Christian brothers and sisters, but these guys don't look like my brothers and sisters, ethnically, by the rituals of their Christian worship, as they developed over 500 years of, you know, separate existence, you know, in terms of contact in this way. And then the other flip side is these sort of, you know, as so often happens with wartime propaganda, the enemy is painted in very sort of simplistic, like kind of demonized terms. You know, it's the Hun, it's the this, it's the, they look like this and they're these barbaric people, and we're the noble ones, right? Every army does that in the history of mankind. Same thing here. You know, there was this picture of these sort of vicious Saracens, and it turned out actually they're an incredibly civilized people with amazing advances in technology and civil infrastructure and polity and luxury goods, and they, man, these Crusaders, they really like this, you know, to go to a bath, right? There's no such thing as a bath in Western Europe at this time, not since the Romans. So there were these luxury goods that the Crusaders were like, wow, actually, this is kind of nice to get to live in this. They actually really adopted the culture of the Levant that had been cultivated well by the Islamic Caliphate. So, you know, those are surprises, and then sort of luxury goods filter back into Europe and become sort of these sought-for items that breed a sort of covetousness. You know, silk and spices are introduced to Europe for the first time. For the first time in 1,000 years, the food isn't so bland. Of course, British food is still very bland. It didn't make its way to England. But you know, very strange consequences of the meeting of worlds that happened in the face of the First Crusade. Second Crusade gets whipped up but doesn't accomplish anything. A city is taken in Lisbon along the way, but it doesn't end up doing anything in the Levant. The papacy needs more money to support this huge new colony that's just, there's been this wholesale slaughter in its establishment. So in order to support it, it starts selling the thing that you used to have to go on crusade to get. Now you could buy for money. You could say, sure, I'll give you, $1,000, and I don't have to go on crusade, but I get all the benefits of that supposed dispensation of mercy. And again, see what authority the Pope is claiming to do, to say he can sort of, by executive authority, determine what your spiritual outcomes are going to be in this life and the next, right? Again, that's a lot more authority than was ever claimed before. I'm going to talk about indulgences in just a minute to explain them theologically. Third Crusade is, again, it's the other one that's really a big military endeavor. This is where we get Richard the Lionheart. It began in sort of military boldness, but then really kind of petered out. Ends up Richard the Lionheart negotiating with the excellent military power of Saladin by pact. And so it's like some of these things, we lump them all under the umbrella of crusades, but this was very different than the First Crusade. Yes, they marched out with swords in hand, but there wasn't military conquest. It ended up being mostly a negotiation. And then you get the rest of these crusades. I'm kind of skipping over this partly because I just don't know all the details very well, but also kind of all blurs together. There's just total disasters at every level, like sort of just miserably sort of cynically presented and argued for, and then, I mean, by the people, like there's this sort of, there's no moral buy-in anymore. There's money involved in this. You get these strange things like these children who, like 12-year-olds who kind of march out, and then they get captured by other Europeans and sold as slaves, as children, and it's like, man, what? Some people think, folklorists think the story of the Pied Piper might be some sort of psychological remembrance of all these kids that just left, So in 1291, all of the Holy Land comes back under Muslim control, as it had been since the 650s. So sort of this 200-year military mess. So in the midst of the Crusades, more horrific things happen. Like I was saying, there's more outbursts of anti-Semitism. Kind of each time a crusade is whipped up, it kind of overspills into anti-Semitic things. And then what initially is a foreignness in encountering Eastern Christians turns into antipathy. And in the Fourth Crusade, they straight up sack Constantinople. So what's supposed to be the Christian city that initially, 150 years before, had actually called for the help that launched the first crusade. By the fourth crusade, they're like, we're just going to like loot and pillage while we're here. You know, who cares that you're Christians in name, right? It's like, what? I mean, look how far we've come from one church, cultural divide, excommunication in 1054, and then in 1204, 150 years later, not even recognizing each other as in any way companion, but actually as enemy that you can just plunder and not worry about. Yeah, this is a crazy, and the Pope in Rome didn't apologize for the sack of Constantinople until like 10 years ago, I think. But like 10 years ago, no, it was in 1994. It was on the 900th anniversary. It was JP2 apologized for the sack. I mean, it's a long time coming. Sidebar, it is important to say that there was a massacre of Latins in Constantinople. What year did this happen? 18 years beforehand. So it wasn't totally unprompted aggression. There was this massacre of the Latins, and this is often actually not remembered in the history. So this wasn't just sort of, while we're here, let's loot and pillage. It was also responding to the reports of this massacre. And the blood has been bad ever since between the Eastern and the Western Church. When the Patriarch of Constantinople today, right now, met with the Pope in Rome just to talk about, just friendly conversation, monks from Mount Athos, who we looked at, came and smeared horse manure in the road in front of the Patriarch of Constantinople to protest talking with that infidel Pope. Right? I mean, there's this sort of, that antipathy is still there from these centuries ago. In Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire fully, just totally conquered by Muslim, religiously Muslim rule of the Ottoman Empire, which is why Turkey is still today a Muslim nation, 90, in a large percentage. When they were under besiege and under great duress, they asked for help, and the Western Latins said, nope, we're not going to do anything. So there's mutual, sort of like punch for punch, to put it very mildly. But then when they really were in need, just totally washed their hands and didn't help in any way. So we see, look at the East and the West just parting in these ways. In our last 15 minutes, I want to talk about some of the degenerations of theology. We looked at sort of the explosion of papal claimed authority and the sort of degeneracy also of the papacy. I want to look at some of the theology that developed, and I say degenerate, as opposed to sort of like growing in a good way, like the way I think we see Trinitarian thinking growing in the 4th century using a more articulate expression than was used sometimes by 1st century teachers, even though it's in the same direction. Here we see theology that began well and then is degenerating. Like it might have started well, but it goes into a bad place. Here's why I owe you an apology. Some of these slides I didn't get to time to flesh out, and I'm very sorry about that. So they'll be invisible, but I will talk about them. So when we talk about indulgences, the backstory is non-existent. The backstory, do you remember when we looked at the Irish monks in the first lecture, who were the first to sort of attach specific sort of remedial / punitive acts to specific sins? That like, if you committed adultery, you need to fast for 4 years to sort of show that you're sorry and be sort of fully reunited into the life of the church with no shame after that, right? They sort of privatized and legalized the way they thought about sins as it affected the public life. Now when we live in individual homes separated by city zone distances and we have cars, sins are so often private, right? But recreate like a 9th century village, nothing you did was private, right? There's no glass in the windows, right? So people knew about your sins. So penance and sort of these penitential acts were to remedy publicly what was done, at some level, quasi-publicly. So that begins with this idea of like, as a way to actually sort of teach the people which sins are sort of degrees of seriousness. Like, well, that is a sin which is definitely, offensive to God, but in the big scale of things, it hasn't done so much damage to your soul or to society, so you just need to fast for 1 week, Or that one's egregious. You need to be on bread and water for a year to show, how, it's actually it was a pastoral gesture. What it ends up, I remember we saw the Latin and the Celtic church getting fused together in the 7th century and kind of informing each other. And so what that evolves to is this idea of what would happen is like this. Let's say if you were caught in adultery and you confessed it and you were repentant, and your pastor was a really stern guy, and he said, you know, you're going to have to not have communion for 10 years because of how serious your sin is. And you're in year 6, and a new pastor comes in, and that guy dies, and you tell him, yeah, I've still got 4 more years of penance. But, according to sort of how the interpretation of what it meant when Jesus said to the apostles, whosoever sins you forgive, they are forgiven, that pastor could say, well, I will grant you the indulgence, do 1 more year, and then you can come back in. So it was an exercise of mercy to actually lessen the severity of penance. That's how indulgences began in the sort of between the 8th and the 10th century. So it becomes this way of actually sort of commuting a sentence, right? In the same way we sort of see this happening in law courts still today. That the precedent for civil law of, well, you said you're sorry, and you don't have a bad record beforehand. Okay, fine, we'll call it a misdemeanor, just do some community service, right? We kind of get the lesson less than the book could have thrown at you. That's what an indulgence is initially. But throw that into what I've been describing about this sort of purchased episcopal, purchased ecclesiastical hierarchies and moral degeneracy and a need for money, and they start getting kind of given out less than judiciously, and then they start getting sold, as we see after the First Crusade. And so what began sort of initially as a pastoral act of mercy in the face of pastoral severity becomes really one of the linchpins for the total moral decay of Christianity in Western Europe. To sell and to give money, it became the thing which people wanted to focus on. Like the natural religious tendency we see in every religion is, give me the easiest way, right? What's the easiest way I can get sort of the bounty that's promised in the afterlife or whatever? And so the people of Western Europe latched onto indulgences, and they were like, heck, I can just do something and get an indulgence, and I don't have to go to church, I don't have to pay my tithe, I don't even have to be a good person, I don't have to live according to the morality of Jesus. If I can, what was meant to sort of be explained at some subtle level, like we saw with scholastic theology last week, that this is actually just a sort of substitution of the temporary outworkings of your penitential life. The peasants who are getting whipped up in the furors don't understand those distinctions. All they see is, wait, so I give a few bucks and I don't go to hell? Done, right? And so there was this sort of token religion of, well, I paid my few bucks, I've got my little indulgence, I'm good. And religious zeal sort of capped off there for many people. So now you can see in the backdrop why a movement like St. Francis, which we looked at last week, would be such a breath of fresh air. Because it's not about indulgences. It's not about some sort of token get out of hell free card. It's about a life lived in imitation of and in connection to the life that's described in the Gospels, of simplicity, of listening to Jesus, of seeking to understand God in true theology, and helping the poor. And so those reform movements of the friars, those were the reform movements against really indulgence piety, which really replaced ordinary Christian life in so many quarters. For pay for crusades. Part of this sort of hand in hand was the development of the understanding of purgatory, which is another doctrine which really decayed in this era. And by decayed, I mean it became more elaborate, which it shouldn't have done, right? Remember one of the things we saw about heresies in the early churches, they tried to add more on top of what was there in the biblical revelation. So it is the case that there's these tiny little verses, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where it says, all who labor in Christian ministry, I'm paraphrasing, their work will be judged. And if what you laid was solid, it'll pass through that judgment. And if what was laid was not solid, it'll be burned up in the fires of that judgment. And some will be saved, none of their work will pass, but they'll be saved as through fire. So that image of sort of coming before God, and in the Psalms, God's presence is described as this sort of consuming fire, consuming, well, what's consumed? Well, what is not godly in us, right? Here we're, so there's these ideas which are definitely a part of like Christian thinking, but it kind of stops there until this sort of apex or nadir, depending on which way you look at it, of the Middle Ages, where, well, maybe there's this place of fire that all Christians go to kind of suffer, and maybe actually that's kind of the antechamber of hell, which you get kind of released from later on. But only Christians get to go there, but everyone goes there to be kind of finally purified. And some of this is reacting to the specter of you've got these monks who are praying all day, and some of them were genuinely holy, like the Cluniac monks. And then you've got sort of city life where you're just kind of buying indulgences and living kind of an immoral life, and your priest bought his role from the corrupt prince. And, you know, there was a felt contrast between a holy Christian and a non-holy Christian, and so there was some sense of need for, man, we're going to need some refinement if we're going to be in the same heaven as those guys, right? So again, you can kind of understand how theologians and teachers were sort of adding, and all of those scholastic theologians that we looked at last time kind of contribute little pieces to this vision. But what it becomes in preaching is there's this miserable place where you're all going to be tormented by demons when you die. But if you do works of penance, scratch that. If you get an indulgence, scratch that. If you buy an indulgence, right, scratch that. Just give us money and you'll have less time in purgatory, right? It gets kind of reduced over time in sort of corruption and popular teaching. And so this idea of this miserable place that you want to get out of. And so, again, fueling this this indulgence-based way of conceiving of Christianity, which is way far afield, right, from anything St. Paul really lived into or talked about. One of the great things that helps to understand Christian history so much is to have in view the paradigm that things can change by degrees and still be the same, and then they can change by more degrees and become something different, right? If I have a bicycle and I attach one of those hubs that kind of stores up a bit of energy, electrical energy, to help boost me up the hill, it's still a bicycle. You know, if I put a 49cc motor in there, that's kind of a moped. You wouldn't really call that a bicycle anymore. You know, if I beef up the suspension, put big tires, well, now I've got a motorbike. That's definitely a motorcycle. That's definitely not a bicycle, right? You can make incremental changes which then fundamentally alter the original thing into something different. And so I think that's what we see with a lot of these medieval theological developments is, you know, you can adapt and sort of develop and explain theology and it's still recognizably the same, right? And then you can keep going and it's not the same anymore. And so when you read some of the theology, for a while, when I was studying these things and I was really loving about sort of learning about the patristic era of the church, I wondered, you know, is it all just inflated? Were the reformers really just fighting a straw man? And so I started reading some 15th century theology, and it's worse than I thought. I was like, oh my gosh, we needed the Reformation. It was so bad. And it was all this sort of mix of purgatory and indulgences mixed together. And a lot of sort of great historians of theology will say these are the two single things that provoked the Reformation. Right? When you read Martin Luther's 95 Theses, as we're going to look at not next week, but in our final lecture, you know, a third of Martin Luther's 95 Theses are about purgatory and indulgences, right? That's what he's coming against, this piety, if you can't call it that, this way of exercising religion that has lost its roots in true Christian devotion. I'm really sorry for not having written slides. Relics become a big thing. What time is it already? I can't quite see. Is it 2:10 already? No, we have 2 minutes. 2:08. Is it, okay. So there's relics. I'll say this, and then I'll begin next lecture with a redeeming piece, which I didn't have time for today. I want to say, so in the midst of all this corruption and difficulty, what I want to say is there's still a thread of earnest Christian life at every level, among priests, bishops, ordinary Christians, that there is people who, out of sort of narrow-mindedness or whatever, fell for and got into all of these sort of extraneous theological developments, who bought into these bloodthirsty crusades and pogroms, and that's all there in this dark era of the church. And in the midst of it, there's also the things we looked at last time, the building of universities and education and all these things, like those are happening at the same time. It's a huge, massive contradiction. But underneath it all, there's regular Christians just seeking to understand and meet their God. And so they're going to church, and it's really in this era that we see church life and sort of agricultural life come together in this actually very beautiful way that, you know, hey, it's harvest day. Let's, the day before harvest, go have a big church service thanking God for the harvest. And that's where you get Lammas Day or Rogation Days, asking for rain and connecting civic life with the feast days. Like, this is why Christmas is still a holiday, because it's like, hey, this is the feast day, this is the day we remember Jesus being born. We shouldn't do any work today. The word holiday comes from holy day, right? And that whole idea of having your agricultural sort of civic life shaped by the festal life of the church really emerges in this era too, which actually promotes sort of a very normal Christianity in the mix of all of the weirdnesses of the era as well. Marian piety develops in this era that we see, Notre Dame, as we've been thinking about, that's French for Our Lady, which means Mary, right? What we see in this era is an understanding of Mary sort of really rising to the fore, and very non-coincidentally, this, rises with the rise of knightly ideals, and sort of the lady that you're fighting for, right? In the sort of crusade militaristic era, it gets theologized, and there's the lady that we're fighting for in theology, this sort of bigger vision of Mary's role in the saving of the world through her son Jesus. So Marian piety gets developed, and with this we'll end. And Eucharistic devotion gets really developed. A new feast gets instituted, the Feast of Corpus Christi. And one of the things that defines some of the literature of the 12th through 14th century is a wild devotion to the Eucharist. And I say wild because some of the stories are crazy. There's a story about like a lady who takes a piece of the consecrated bread home, and her plan is to put it in her garden to try and magically bless the crops. And she gets sick, and she goes to her confessor, and she confesses, "Yeah, I stole some of the Eucharist and buried it instead of eating it." And she goes and she looks, and the bees are worshipping around the Eucharist in the beehive. These wonderful medieval stories. But actually, which we're told to be instructive to be, use the Eucharist in the right way. It's powerful, but it's not magic. So we actually see correction even in the wild kind of magical sounding stories. Transubstantiation gets defined by Aquinas. In fact, the Eucharist gets elevated so high into such a sort of vision that it becomes too high, and people start getting kind of afraid of it and kind of shying away. By the 12th century, people are actually having to be forced by canon law to receive communion once a year because they're not receiving at all. Again, two things I want to connect in terms of degeneracy. Schism in the church leads to all of, I think, the degeneracy of the West. And actually, failing to receive communion, I think, allowed for the reception of false religion of indulgences and purgatory, that actually it was not receiving communion that led really to so much of the difficulty. And instead, what replaced receiving was just seeing communion. You can go to some old churches in England, and there'll be a wooden box for a prince to sit in, and there'll be a tiny hole carved out so that when the priest lifts up the bread, he can see it. And it's oh, I saw it, and then you would leave. I was well, what? No, Jesus said, take and eat. It's actually in the Bible. Eat this, right? And so the Bible's getting neglected, and again, one of the many things that would end up being pruned back in the Reformation era. So I want to just kind of flag all those things. I realize this is an impossible quantity of things to talk about in so short a time. But yeah, underneath this, there is, I think actually sort of elevation of the Eucharist initially was a real source of life, and then the abandonment of it, saying too much about it, ended up putting people off and being a cause of difficulty. So next time I'm going to begin with a sort of historical fiction description of a 14th century communion service, just so you can kind of picture in a thick way the world in which we're speaking. And I want to sort of dovetail in, sorry, let me say this. Next week I'm traveling and I can't be here, so we'll have no class next week. But the week right after that will be our last lecture together. And what I want to pick up on is, in the wake of all of this degeneracy and corruption and difficulty, the mind of the church adapts and comes up with ideas to move forward into the era in which we live now, and the sort of progressing ultimately towards the Reformation. So we'll begin with sort of a thick description 2 weeks from now of a Eucharist, and then I want to begin with the 13th century, and we'll look at sort of all the things that emerged in the face of such corruption that would then actually allow for kind of the healing of the church in a way in the era in which we now live. So. Yeah, okay, so there you go. See you guys, not next week, but in 2 weeks' time. All right.